software department. I have a personal hatred of slides. I just find myself reading them constantly rather than listening to the speakers. So what I've done here is I've kind of put my sources up on the slideshow rather than actually getting more information generally. So sorry if that's not you, that's the way I've done it. Why Agile, plus history of Agile from Napoleonic Wars to DevOps. So I'm trying to kind of ask the question, is Agile arbitrary? Is it actually any better than what we had previously? Where does it come from? I got asked the dreaded question by somebody who was non-technical, who managed a different department in some of recently unit. What is Agile? They were looking to apply some of the principles in their own area. That dreaded "what is Agile" question came up. And this is kind of the talk that I want to stick with, if you like. There's always a danger when you're in an Agile organization that it could seem like groupthink. It becomes a bit of a religion. And I just kind of want to ask the question of where it comes from. Why do we willingly sacrifice ourselves at the Agile board? So, how do I change this slide? Change slides. Yeah. So I want to start in 1806. It was being serious about the Napoleonic Wars. The French are fighting the Prussians, and the Prussian army is split into two, and so is the French, and they meet each other at two twin battles. The Battle of Jena and the Battle of Eichstätt. And the army splits aren't quite even, so you've got the large contingent of the Prussian army meeting the small contingent of the French army at Eichstätt, and vice versa at Jena, where Napoleon's in charge of the French. This was kind of a defining moment in the Napoleonic Wars. So the Prussian army and the French army are two very different organizations. The Prussian army, if we've got any Game of Thrones fans here? Anybody listen to Game of Thrones? Cool. So if you're Game of Thrones fans, you need to think about these guys as kind of the on-side. They're not going to advance unless they're told to advance, they're not going to retreat unless they're told to retreat, they're not going to move left unless they're told to move left. So that's kind of the way that the Prussians have organized themselves. All information flows into high command, and the king kind of decides where things go, and it all flows back out again. And the French army are experienced. They're a bit of a rabble, to be honest with you. I mean, they're a bunch of peasants who've kind of got this revolutionary fervour and are very keen on what they're doing. They're well led. I mean, obviously, Napoleon's famous for leading his people well. But they don't have this kind of very strict hierarchy in quite the same way. And in the Battle of Eichstätt, which is where the Prussians have their large contingents, they've got 2-to-1 numerical advantage against the French. The French just go walk over them and completely slaughter them. And Napoleon was so surprised by this that he actually told his messenger that he was wrong. That's not the other, because it was just a completely unexpected result. He wasn't expecting those two armies to meet. A lot of people were asking questions following that, obviously, and still do about what happened. And there's one chap who was 6 years old at the time who went on to lead the Prussian army later on in the 1870s during the Franco-Prussian War. And which had a very different outcome. The Prussians hung on against them. And he asked that question. He came up with a different answer from most people. Instead of saying, this is all about the brilliant French tactics and the brilliant generals, he said that actually what's wrong is the organization of our army. And he suggested that there were three kind of gaps where you get this friction in war. The first is that you don't know the situation as well as you would like. You don't have complete knowledge. The second is that there's an alignment gap between what you ask your people to do and what they actually do. And the third is that even if they do exactly what you ask them to do, there's an effects gap, as in it doesn't have the effect that you expect. So even in perfect knowledge and with perfect alignment, you still get things going wrong. And this is particularly true in war, where you've got this very chaotic situation. The ships are getting the fan constantly. Things are changing very rapidly. It's a very dynamic environment. So he decided that there must be a better way of getting that ability for people to respond on the ground. It's a difficult situation because in an army you need to have that coordinated strategy. You need to have your army working as one. But he saw that actually to have autonomy on the ground doesn't mean that you haven't got direction. And the way that he solved that, described that circle, is to say that he was going to communicate his orders instead of in directions to move forward, to retreat, in terms of intent, context, and the boundaries that we've got. So the intent is, I don't know, there's one battle in the 1870s war where they were trying to funnel the French into a bit of a roadblock between a river on one side and a border on the other side that they couldn't cross. They wanted to kind of box them in a triangle. So the left-hand side of the army, he said to one of his senior generals, the intent here is to make sure that these guys don't cross the river. That is your intent. The context in that situation would be, the rest of our army is moving around the right to box them in, or whatever it is. And we know the French positions are here, here, and here, and this is the information that we've got coming in. And the boundaries are, you've got this number of troops to do it, it's the kind of constraints, it's the resources that you have available to you. Okay? And he was very clear about this. He trained up all of his men, all of his officers, and spent a lot of time drilling into exactly how to give orders. That was a real kind of core thing in his military schools. It took us a long time to learn these lessons, and I'm thinking here particularly of the Battle of the Somme. We have a lot of scars to show for it in our history. And if you look at the Battle of the Somme, where we were asked to kind of go over the top of the walking place for wave after wave, and quite clearly we hadn't destroyed the machine gun post on the other side of the artillery fire, and yet it was taking a long time for the message to get back up to high command to make a decision and get it back down to the troops. And our troops had no way of changing what they were doing on the ground. They just had to follow the very kind of strict directions to walk over no man's land. They weren't even have to run. So that's 20,000 deaths to that point to begin with. But we did eventually pick it up. The Germans had this in place throughout the beginning of the 20th century, and it's one of the reasons why their army was so effective in the First and Second World Wars, as you argued. I don't think I need to extrapolate on how effective they were in those wars. They were, the casualty percentages, they were hugely effective. But we eventually picked it up, and it took them alliance with West Germany before we did. That's mission command is now, which is exactly the system of content, intent, and context, intent, and constraints and values. That was picked up in NATO in the 1970s, and it's no essential to the way that our army works. But while we were trying to figure out what was so wrong with our troops, because there's a quote from Churchill that I know, but I couldn't find it. There's some quote from Churchill saying, how bad our troops were and they couldn't fight properly. But there's a lot of that kind of stuff if you start looking for it. So we were confused by this lot. But while we were trying to work out what was bad with our troops, there's this chap called Taylor who comes along, and he writes this book called The Principles of Scientific Management. Okay, and he's your typical kind of Industrial Revolution boss, if you like, very posh guy, gentleman type person, and yeah, he comes out with this thing. He's a real baddie in the story, by the way, called the Principles of Scientific Management. The first and most important point here is that he states that there was only one way of doing things, and that's the best way. So he had this idea that he was going to scientifically prove inside an organization what the best way to work is, what the most efficient way to work is, and then impose that uniformly across the whole organization. Okay, but there are other things in here that come with this thinking. I haven't actually read the whole book, but in kind of the time, the thought process all the time, there are a lot of kind of common sense things coming along, which Taylorism is kind of part of and connected with. If you're looking at a manufacturing situation, one of the things that he said was if you want to reduce the cost of a thing, you need to reduce the cost of each part that you're making. Okay, so if you're making a car, you want to reduce the cost of making steering wheels, you want to reduce the cost of making gear sticks, etc. And then he said that actually to do this, it makes sense to have large batch sizes, because if I've got one oven and I'm trying to bake something, it's much more efficient to have one big oven and bake 2,000 loaves of bread at once. So there's a cost reduction in the larger batch size, so that's a good thing. So we need large batch sizes. And he also said, inventory is an asset. Or at least that's the thinking at the time. All these things seem like a lot of common sense, really. So what I mean by inventory is an asset is if you've got a lot of steering wheels and you're trying to build cars, then that's a good thing, right? You've got loads of steering wheels, that's a start. So that's the way that he thought, and it's not. I mean, it's all common sense stuff, right? It's quite difficult to argue against in some respects. But there are a few problems with it. Firstly, if if I'm making a car again, just to take that analogy, and I'm making my steering wheels or my gear sticks, let's say, for a very, very low cost, but I'm not making as many of them as I am steering wheels, then what you end up with is piles and piles of steering wheels. Okay? And actually, if you think about that, that can be thought of as a cost as well as an asset, because you've put money into making those steering wheels, you've put resources in terms of people and in terms of time and in terms of raw materials into making that. So you can think about that as a big pile of cash. You can actually count it up and say that's cash that the company has spent. So yeah, and also you've got this idea of there being one best way, and obviously that conflicts directly with what I've just spoken about with Russians and General Monk, who's that 6-year-old who had a great idea. Your workers have knowledge, they live in a dynamic environment, they need to be able to respond to the situation on the ground. And if you're going to impose the one best way on things, that's a huge barrier to change. Even to try and get the information back up from the ground that there's a better way of doing things, and then get it back down and get it imposed everywhere. That's a very difficult situation. So, slide. Right. This guy, Elijah Goldratt. Has anybody read The Goal? Good. It's a really good book for those of you who haven't. I suggest it strongly. So he comes along with his theory of constraints in 1984, and this is the book that he releases with his theory of constraints. It's kind of happens at the same time. And he says, right, guys, we need to forget about inventory as an asset, inventory as a cost, and we need to forget about optimizing locally. Optimizing locally can be extremely damaging. What we should be doing is optimizing to build a car. You're trying to build cars, you're not trying to build steering wheels. So even if you end up building those steering wheels at a higher cost, you can still reduce the cost that it takes to build a car. So you need to think about the thing globally. He also not only says that inventory is a cost, he also talks about flow. It's all about flow. Okay, so when he's talking about flow, he's talking about the amount of time that it takes to get a bunch of raw materials into the factory and to churn out a car at the other end from that bunch of raw materials. And if you try and get that time as small as possible, then you're going to be able to respond to your customer needs much more quickly. And the way to get that time down is to reduce your batch sizes. Because if you have to wait for another 999 steering wheels when you've built one before you can assemble them, whatever it is in the batch, that's bad news, right? And the other thing that he was very anti was work in process, which is the fact that you're still working on an item, because that reduces your flow, it reduces the amount of time, so it increases the amount of time it takes to get raw materials out the door as a working product. Right, so note back. It's very obvious when I tell you to change slides.
Yeah.
So you're probably, I don't know whether you're getting a bit bored or not, but there's a question here as to how you apply this sort of software at this moment, right? Because this is not software that we've been speaking about so far. So what has this to do with software? Well, software and manufacturing, for a start, are both very similar. You're both trying to build things. I know it's a different problem. I know in manufacturing you're trying to build a car 1 million times possibly, and you build the same thing over and over again. But this is actually where Molt's ideas become particularly important, because you're living in a dynamic environment where feedback is important. You need to be able to respond to the situation in the ground, because you're not doing the same thing over and over again. So, software is inherently difficult to plan. The feedback's important, like I say. You don't know what you're going to make until you make it. And it's not just the external feedback. I think people tend to think of external feedback when they look at this from the outside. It's the internal feedback. The process of making software is you're constantly feeding off the bits that you've already done. But we still have workstations in software like we do in manufacturing. If you think about your workstation as being the thing that the workstation that paints the bodywork, for example, that produces these steering wheels, they're each individual functions. We still have an equivalent to that in software. You've still got situations like the people who test the software, the people who build the user interface, or design the user interface, the people, maybe you can split it up and say you've got front-end specialists, JavaScript specialists, and people who are JavaScript specialists, and all this kind of stuff. They're all different workstations. So that's a parallel that we've got with manufacturing. What about inventory? It's interesting to try and find a parallel for inventory. I think, in my mind, if you're used to agile, inventory is almost directly parallel with those user stories that you're going through your Scrum board, your Kanban board. You can think of that as inventory. If you've got a bunch of that piling up before one of the workstations, That's like a large batch size or a bunch of students piling up before the assembly. So there are lots of parallels that you can draw when you start to think about it properly. And I want to switch to a story of Sumdog, where until last summer we were guilty of optimizing locally in a way that I know, just because of speaking to people like Daniel and people, things that you guys aren't to the same extent. But we had the situation where we had to test department as a separate department from the software development department. And we did that because we were optimizing locally, we were trying to reduce the cost of tests. We had some students in who we didn't pay a huge amount coming in from the university and being our testers, and they were working on ships. And we'd work in development, we'd get something ready for test, and we'd ship it across to the test department, and they would find bugs in it, and then they'd ship it back to the development department, and they'd fix them, and so on and so forth. What happened in that situation was that the test department's workload was extremely spiky. We ended up in a situation where sometimes they would have very little to do, and sometimes they'd have an awful lot to do, depending on where we were in the development cycle. So the test became extremely difficult to predict. That's how long something was going to take in test. And what that meant is that we as managers, we want to have some accountability, we want to know when stuff's going to be released, but it was an unfair question to ask our developers when stuff was going to be released, because nobody knew how long something was going to take in test. So we ended up asking our developers when something going to be ready for test instead. And those of you who are experienced programmers will start to see a cascade of problems coming in. So what happened in that situation? So we had a whole load of known bugs being put into test the whole time, because people were being motivated towards getting stuff ready for test, so why would they want to make sure it's high quality? So the testers were wasting a lot of time finding defects that the developers were perfectly well aware of and passing it back into development. There was absolutely zero incentive to make something easy to test. There was no effort being made at all to put testing tools in to build any kind of components that were easy to test inside the software department, because again, there was no reason to. You were being told you were giving a deadline to get something into test, and it was often a very tight deadline too. There was no way that the developers were running a test. It was seen as extremely inefficient if they did, because the testers are cheaper, so why were we using developers to do so? The testing triangle. You're familiar with the testing triangle? Put your hand up if you're familiar with the testing triangle. Yeah, that's something. Okay. So the testing triangle is this idea that I could go into more detail, but the core of it is the idea that you're trying to test your software as soon as you can, the earliest possible time. The reason for that is if you stack a whole load of code on top of a bug, then you may have to change all that code that's sitting on top of it, basically. So we were doing the exact opposite. There was a very little incentive, although some good people. So some people were doing this, but very few people were doing test-driven development, for example, because it's just going to slow down getting stuff into tests. So again, the incentive is wrong. And then you get all the secondary problems, like all this stuff going back at a test is causing massive distractions inside development. We've got some task switching. We're actually releasing a whole lot of defects at this point because testers are incapable of picking up this. They pick up 1,000 bugs out of 1,001, but when you've got that bug, you put in, you're not going to pick up everything. So there's an awful lot of fixing stuff going on in production. I'm sitting here top of this tree, and my main job at this time is prioritizing test. It's what an inordinate amount of time I spent there. So a year ago, we stopped doing this, and we had a few students around for the whole summer, so we decided to split things up and put them into the development teams. See how it works, and it just completely revolutionized ourselves. So there's a small lesson here, right, which is that we should have cross-functional teams and we should integrate testing into our teams. But actually, there's a bigger lesson here, and it relates directly back to the theory of constraints, and that is that local optimization is bad. You should avoid it, we want to have cross-functional teams in general. We were also very guilty of large batch sizes. So we were developing huge chunks at once. It's very kind of waterfall-ish, and a large batch going from development into test. And then, of course, when we found a defect in that batch, we were hacking around the edges to try and fix it. We were increasing the technical debt, and we were very often getting a very bad user experience because these defects are not all technical defects. Some of these defects are things wrong with what we expect the user experience to be. So you end up with this horrible mess of botched stuff, right? But then, when we brought the testers in, the key point is that we were able to give the whole team a responsibility for getting it out. rather than being responsible for getting the test, we were able to shift the responsibility to getting that. It's not, the key point is not that we brought the test into the team, the key point is that we were able to shift that responsibility to getting stuff out as well. So the focus, therefore, is always on the constraints, right, within the team, because the whole team is motivated to get stuff out. If the constraint is the test, then everybody jumps into the test. Or is it? Slide. Right. So there's one constraint that we still ignore to some extent, and I know that a lot of other companies do. And there are large batch sizes going into it. You've got all of these user stories building up before this column on the Scrum board, and of course it's the release, right? And the first principle, the very first principle of the Agile Manifesto, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. You're probably all familiar with the term continuous delivery, and yet it's something that a lot of companies, at least in terms of the modern interpretation that phrase continuous delivery, still haven't quite got on. So why is it taking us so long? Well, kind of the simple answer is releases are hard. Now, if you go back to when this was written, most software was still being delivered on CDs. You're not going to release a new CD every 2 minutes or whatever it is that doesn't do less than a second. It's not going to happen, right? But things have got steadily better over the last couple of decades. First of all, the introduction of software as a service. Then we've got the cloud. And I think that this movement, DevOps movement, is kind of the final piece in that puzzle. So what is it that books like the DevOps Handbook tell us to do? I think it's all pretty old hat, if you've got the context, right? What they're telling us to do is to move the operations people into the development team, hence the name, right? So you've got a cross-functional team, and put a global goal on each user story to get it released, rather than to get it ready for release. So you need that global goal on the whole company, on the whole team. It comes directly from the theory of constraints. The problem is, as we all know, this is much easier said than done, and there are whole libraries written about this stuff, and it's different in each organization and everything else. But that's why it's so important. Right. So what's missing from this discussion? Slide. So if you'd asked me a couple of years ago what Agile was, I think I would have come out with an answer, something along the lines of Agile is the ability to continuously gather and respond to feedback. And just for clarity, I would have meant internal feedback as well as external feedback. And so things like retrospectives kind of come into it. I think that's how I would have summarized Agile. My thoughts moved on to it being more of a toolbox of things like Kanban and Scrum and various other kind of best practices. And then it moved on again to this is how I now answer the question, what is Agile? So, that's kind of where I am. But that original insight that Agile is the ability to continuously gather and respond to feedback, that still seems valid. And it still seems actually like really central to what Agile is. But there's this payoff, right, between the best way to do something and having the autonomy to respond to feedback. Because as I say, there's this massive barrier, particularly as your organization grows, towards imposing the best way everywhere and having this feedback and being able to do something with it. So you can't have both. So I'm sure that the idea that we wanted people to respond, the companies wanted to respond to feedback is age old. I'm sure it dates back to when Taylor was around, people who said it. It's just that the relative importance of imposing that best way and responding to that feedback has switched recently. And we understand now that uniformity is a barrier to change. And again, this comes back, of course, to the Agile Manifesto, the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. It's written. So let's just talk about this, because I think it was Morg who was the first person to kind of realize this back in the 1870s when he was winning that war. Because in my mind, the word context and feedback are basically interchangeable in this discussion. Because as you're discovering feedback, what you're doing really is you're exploring the context that you're working with. So you've got the intent, which is the strategical direction. Sorry, I skipped ahead. Forget about that last sentence. Scrap that. Right. But what's interesting actually is, and this is a slightly uncomfortable truth, is that Mock's insights, even in its own time, need to live alongside with Taylor's. There is no absolute here. Just because we want to be able to respond to feedback doesn't mean that we shouldn't be listening to years and years of best practice. And there's an awful lot of it out there. The army tends to call it tactics, and that's a term that's started to be used in business as well. So we've got to have Mock and Taylor's ideas living together. And I think of tactics in these terms anyway, when I'm talking about software, as being things like Kanban and Scrum and extreme programming, all that kind of tool set stuff that comes along with Agile. Cool, but then there's this line here: individuals and interactions over process and tools. So, to my mind, what that means is that the individual is always above the process, and none of this is unquestionable. Even the most basic things that we hold, they can all be challenged. What I'm saying is that you need a very good reason not to follow. It's not an everyday kind of occurrence if you're going to switch away from them. It's just that so even at that very fundamental level, there is still some room for autonomy. But actually, if you then look at these tactics again, you see that there's even more room for autonomy, because things like Scrum and Kanban, and you can use Scrum if you're really crazy, but they're basically neither or thing, right? You still got a choice, even amongst this group of best practice very often. So we've got this picture now of the strategical level coming from Mock's ideas of communicating intent and context and constraints that you've got. So that's the kind of direction that you're given. And that lives perfectly alongside autonomy. There's no reason for those two to conflict. You can have the best of both coming from Mock. And then we've got this tactical level at the bottom, which is the idea that there are best practices out there and we should be following them. But the point is that this is a sandwich, and there's a big bunch of stuff in the middle, which some people are calling operations, and that's where autonomy lives, right? And that's where you've got a lot of freedom to figure out and respond to the dynamic environment that we all work in and the changing environment that we all work in. Slide. Right, so in conclusion, what is Agile? I would say that it is software development coming of age. It's the application of hundreds of years of experience learnt in domains as different as war and manufacturing. Certainly not arbitrary. It's professionalism applied to software development. That's my answer. Cool. Let's move on.
So what's Unlock doing in, what's your next step in it, in terms of Agile or delivery or whatever?
Well, it's continuous delivery that we're really working towards. We've changed quite a lot since you were there in terms of doing things in a fairly proper Agile way. We tend to use Scrum and we split everything up into small user stories, and we've got this named through. So continuous delivery is what we're fighting with at the moment. There are some barriers to that, particularly around some of the processes that we still have in place around quality assurance. Mm-hmm. So things like we still run our FSTs before and after each release, and they're still picking things up every now and again. So a lot of this is to do with the state of the code base to some extent. Some of it's quite difficult to do TDD in because of the way that it was built originally. We also need to do a lot more in terms of metrics and alarming on our metrics when things do go wrong, so we can pick up on it very quickly and have very short time things do go wrong, so that we can trust clicking the button and clicking it out means that it's safe. So currently we're working on that metric side of things. We're working on automating our FST, having the end-to-end tests automated in there. And we're making big inroads in terms of quality. The number of red balls, for those of you who haven't practiced under, is basically a hotfix idea. They're way down on where they were. We've seen sort of a couple of months compared to a week or so. So we're definitely making massive strides towards it, and I'd hope that we'll be there in the next 6 months or so. But yeah, this is the way.
Are you able to separate deployment from release? How are you doing that?
So we've got dark releases, is that what you're referring to? Yeah. So we're doing quite a lot of stuff out behind Flickr already, which is proving actually very successful. We're doing a lot more A/B testing as a result of that, and as a result of the metrics that we're starting to pick up. So those are good things. I know that your challenges here are different. I've spoken to Daniel enough to understand that the volume of users that we've got is way above yours. So some of this metric stuff is going to be different. Yeah, as I said.
I just wonder, how do you sometimes just, because I think the big problem when you realise, oh, we're not doing things we live, we should be doing it, but that entails a bunch of things that are potentially really expensive because you need fast tests, the code might be legacy, not testable, you might need to dockerize stuff, all these things take time and effort and experience. And I've witnessed that often it's very hard to come up to justification and say to the business, look, we're not going to deliver anything for this amount of time. Well, not anything, but a lot less because we invest in this thing. So it's almost like investing to buy new machinery, thinking that you will have a return maybe in 6 months, maybe in a year's time, because it's very long term. And often these things always take longer, like refactor something, docker always takes longer than you think. So I think that's mainly a problem for perhaps larger sort of enterprise size organizations where
I recognise that problem. It's definitely there. So don't get me wrong, but I think that we can do an awful lot of chipping away at these things more than kind of meets the eye to begin with. There's a lot of times where we can put a nice facade up in front of something and then kind of chip away at the back end a little bit and move across to a new system. And I don't see this as an overnight change. It's not going to happen overnight. But what it will mean is that you're starting to improve the areas of the code base that you're working in disproportionately. So you may have something that you don't touch very often that works fine. It's in the corner somewhere. It's not tested and it's a horrible mess. But so what? You can still begin to move across slowly by chipping away at the things that you're actually currently working on. And that isn't necessarily a cost to the business, at least it isn't when you're in an extreme situation like we were in Sunderland, because what we've discovered is by doing things more thoroughly and doing things properly up front and buying ourselves a little bit more time to do the initial bit, we're then getting so many efficiencies back from the quality of the work that we're producing and the reduction in defects that we're making. But I think we're realistically moving 2-3 times as fast as we were a year ago, and we're getting through a lot of this stuff. So I mean, it's horses for courses. I'm not saying you're in the same position that we were, but in our position, if you can figure out how to break it up and you can figure out how to tackle it in small chunks as you're working in that area, then it's been a solution for us. It's not always possible to do that. There are some things, we've got the game services, for example, guys who are looking at that recently, still horrendously old versions of Java and all the rest of it, and we were trying to get state off them, and it's just not possible to do in small chunks. It's literally right. And it's been delayed as a result. So it's not a complete answer, is what I'm saying. It's a way to tackle 90% of the problems.
Right. Yeah. We're about to hire some more QA engineers going from like 1 to several.
Yeah.
And we're kind of discussing whether they should be integrated into the teams or work as a QA team. And it sounds like you recommend individually, but was there any advantages for them working together as a team?
So there are a lot of arguments for it, whether they actually materialize themselves as advantages is a different question. There are a lot of things around wanting to have different people look at the same functionality, people having a broader understanding of the website as a whole, the context they're working in. So in our situation, the advantages way outweigh that inside the team. But like I said, the important thing here is not so much that you have an integrated team, although I think there are other advantages there. It's more that you can put this global goal on people and say that your goal is to get it out as a group of people. So I wouldn't suggest it, but you could have a situation where they're seconded to different teams at different times, as long as you've got the sprint being a global goal with your clusters and perhaps that's a halfway house. I think there's huge advantages from having a team together, working as a team for a long period of time in a relatively stable state. I think you get a lot of camaraderie that way, and people know how each other work and the strengths and the weaknesses. You begin to estimate that and all the rest of this kind of stuff.
So, I mean, it's an interesting situation, but I worked in the past with the testers well separated from the development team, like you said, and it was pretty bad because you tend to create barriers, you create handovers,
Yes.
and you also delegate responsibility. So as a developer, it's not my responsibility to check the code is right.
Exactly.
As a tester, it's not my responsibility to try and figure out why this is wrong.
Mhm.
I've seen that when we do testing in teams, I might be testing somebody else's work, but given that I found a problem, I might go and figure out, oh, I think this is the problem. So I might send the work back and say, there's a problem with yours, I think this is the problem. So we kind of, we don't say, it's not working, it's your problem.
Yeah.
We cooperate to
To try and work around.
the common goal, so.
That's it. I mean, that's the key, because you're talking about the constraints there being in different places. Sometimes the constraints in development, sometimes it's in test. And what you're doing there is you're working fluidly, so that you're constantly tackling the constraint within your team to get everything out as efficiently as possible. One of the other advantages that we had when we moved testers into the teams was we had a lot of bureaucracy around communication, and you remember that horrible Jira code that we had. Just trying to get stuff written up the whole time. There's a lot of kind of guff that comes with trying to solve that communication problem that doesn't exist. You just got somebody sitting next to you.
Did you find the same with product owners and product managers? So the moment we have a kind of stretched product team who we don't have enough product managers ready to go around for every team, do you think that also makes a difference?
So, like I say, the fundamental thing here is that you can work together towards the common goal as a team. As soon as you start splitting people so they've got multiple teams, that can become difficult if there are the constraints simultaneously in two teams at once, and they're overstretched. Ultimately, you've perhaps got a problem with the amount of resource that you've got in that situation. It's much better the way that we work, and I suspect that you work too, which is to have a product owner, an individual product owner, working with an individual development team on a particular product. Even if that product owner is also working with another development team on a different product. I think just having that kind of alignment going through, so that you've not got two different product owners that you're trying to deal with who are also flipping between every single other product in the company. That's where it gets very difficult. I mean, we work with limited resources. It's as simple as that. For DevOps, interestingly, I mean, the clues in the name, guys. DevOps is the whole idea of that DevOps movement is that you start putting the teams together and you give the operations, some of the operations workstation into the development teams as well. So what we're doing there, we've only got 1.5. We've got one very good intern and a lead DevOps person. But what I'm trying to do is to train up kind of DevOps representatives in each team. So there's lots of kind of halfway houses. And the idea is anything that's specific to each team is dealt with by that DevOps representative in the team, while it's the kind of the big ticket stuff is dealt with by the separate DevOps team. And anything that's DevOps is code reviews and directed by the central team, even if the work isn't actually done there. So I'm trying to train those guys up in things like Jenkins and a little bit of AWS and Docker and all these sorts of systems. Cool.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, guys.
Yeah, I think it's around as well, but go on. I'll ask the group, which is very particular, like